heaven, hyperspace, and the many mansions of God. I just need to see what the next... oh, there we go. Okay, going back. Okay, great. So we began this morning with that beautiful and somewhat obscure teaching from Jesus. What are these many mansions? Where are they? How can we kind of go and have a peek? And he also says later, there are many things in John's Gospel, he says, there are many things I have not told you. And that there's much to be revealed. And this is consistent across all the great spiritual traditions of the world, that we are told there are these other realms, there are these other dimensions, and that they are accessible to us in some way, or at least to some of us. And so the question is, what are they talking about? How can we come to know these things? How do they function in our lives? And I'm going to begin this morning with some scientific evidence for these many mansions that was presented at this conference that I recently attended. It was spoken to in many different ways, but I want to give credit to this wonderful Canadian, great tribute to the great nation of Canada, Professor Mario Beauregard, originally from Montreal, who's now a professor at the University of Arizona. And here's his picture. And I was fortunate to be chairing the session at which he gave his presentation. And what he presented on, he's a professor at the University of Arizona, and he is the president of the Academy for the Advancement of Non-Materialist Science. So this is a science that goes beyond the traditional understanding of materialism. And as most of you know, or should know, if you're here, this whole assumption of materialism, that all of existence can be reduced to matter-energy interactions, is actually a grand metaphysical assumption that is not supported by the spiritual evidence, and increasingly, it's not supported by the scientific evidence. It's becoming increasingly unscientific to maintain this position of scientific materialism. And we'll be exploring that more deeply in the Monday night sessions. But by way of overview, so what he presented here, what Mario presented here, was first of all something we've been discussing and we looked at somewhat last week, is that quantum physics in particular has invalidated the metaphysical assumptions associated with scientific materialism. And in particular, there's two aspects of it, because there's quantum weirdness, there's wave-particle duality, there's all those things. But there's two keys that are really essential. One is the non-locality. And non-locality means that distance between different parts of the universe is actually an illusion, ultimately. And I would think of non-locality as a synonym for the absence of separation. What non-locality means is that ultimately there's no ontological separation between anything in the universe and anything else. And this is the reason that we have the other primary contribution from quantum physics, which is currently called quantum entanglement. And quantum entanglement essentially says that everything is intimately interconnected in some fundamental way with everything else. Everything is connected with everything else. Does that remind you of Chief Seattle, the web of life, and humanity? We are merely a strand in it, and whatever we do to the web affects the entire web, including us. It's that principle. It's the holographic principle. It's expressed in many different ways. But quantum entanglement is a very important concept because it's essentially the scientific emerging discovery of that one power and presence that's operative in the universe and in our life, essentially the first unity principle, which we find represented across all the traditions. It's Advaita, non-duality, in Hinduism. It's Tawheed, oneness, in Islamic mysticism. It's this oneness that is testified to across all of the traditions. And quantum physics is now moving towards recognizing that oneness. Nevertheless, as Mario pointed out, many contemporary scientists still maintain this reductive materialist view of the world, as we all know. Now, he actually summarized two categories of evidence that is basically deconstructing this materialist view of the world. The first one, evidence for which a materialist explanation is inadequate and includes phenomena suggesting that the mind is not limited to space and time. And in this category, he summarized some of the leading categories of evidence, including clairvoyance, remote viewing, telepathy, precognition, psychokinesis, distant mental influence on living systems, some of the prayer work of Larry Dossey, if you know his work of healing prayers. And in particular, he mentioned the experiments at the Princeton Engineering Anomaly Research Lab, which was at Princeton University. And interestingly enough, I worked there as a research scholar 35 years ago. I joined that team. And we studied in particular remote viewing and psychokinesis. And that'll be the subject of a future talk because that was a very transformative time. But suffice it to say, as Mario pointed out, that this laboratory did 28 years of cutting-edge scientific research and produced voluminous data demonstrating the reality of these effects with a probability of by chance of less than 1 in a trillion. And yet they were never able to get a single paper published in any of the mainstream scientific publications. And actually, as one of the editors of Physical Review Letters, which is one of the standard physics publications, admitted, he actually said, that is true. I worked at Physical Review Letters. I was part of the team that reviewed, and I saw the process in which this data was excluded a priori, not allowed, not admissible, into the orthodox halls of science. That is becoming an increasing problem for the mainstream scientific worldview as this evidence is mounting. The other category of evidence, as Mario explained, is evidence that's rejected outright by the materialist theories of the mind because they have no way of beginning to even begin to try to explain it. And in this category we have, for example, near-death experience, which has been experienced by 25 million people now, in which they have out-of-body experiences, a life review, often a sense of a tunnel. And we'll go into some of these details more in other talks and in our Monday night series, because it's fascinating data to really look into. But what they have in particular are experiences of what they frequently refer to as heaven, or as otherworldly realms, that they actually enter some of these many mansions that Jesus speaks of. And this happens not only through near-death experience, but also through meditation and prayer practices where we come to a place where we are able to still the mind. Still the mind completely and come into the silence, the eternal silence. And what happens is we go through a gateway and we come into another whole realm of spiritual presence. So it's like through the gateway of inner silence, we come into a place of union with the eternal. As the first definition of yoga in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali puts it, yoga, which means union, is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. And that's the reason for the importance of silent prayer and meditation. He also reported on the reincarnation research of Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker and others, in which there are 2,500 cases of children reporting a previous life. And they've done a whole categorization of these cases and organized them by their credibility, because they have different varying degrees of kind of verifiable details. And the top 5 or 10% of these cases that meet all of those criteria are incredible body of evidence for the reality of the soul incarnating multiple times. And Ian Stevenson tried everything he could to reach another conclusion, but he said this is the only theory that he could come up with that explains all of the data. Again, all of this is roundly and soundly rejected by the mainstream scientific enterprise to this day. So what we have and what he concluded is the available scientific evidence contradicts the materialist view that mind and consciousness are produced solely in the brain. This is the basic assumption of contemporary neurophysiology. Consciousness is a side effect of the electrical and chemical processes taking place in the brain. And as he pointed out, that's equivalent to assume that consciousness is produced in the brain is like saying that the television program is produced inside the TV set. It is. It's completely the same assumption. Because if you play around with some of the consciousness neurochemistry of the brain, it affects your consciousness. The same way if you play around with the controls on the television, it affects the image and the sound. But that does not prove that the image and the sound come from inside the TV set. So, and what he then concluded quite beautifully, excuse me while I clear my throat. It's hard to even speak this. It's such unorthodoxy. How dare I be up on a platform proclaiming this as a scientist, no less. So what he said was that this non-materialist paradigm re-enchants the universe, restores the dignity and the power of human beings. It fosters positive values, compassion, respect, care, peace, love, and promotes an awareness of our deep interconnection with other beings, and in particular with those other mansions, those many mansions that we can enter, that we will be drawn up into if we give ourselves fully to this vertical respiration practice, to this prayer practice that will basically raise the vibrational frequency of our consciousness and then lift us into these realms. It's not something we can do on our own. It's something that's done for us when we give ourselves in full authenticity and sincerity to this mystery that we call God. So how do we explain all this? Last week we were looking at holograms and quantum physics. And this was a metaphor that we came up with. It's just a diagram. But here you can think of this as the entire universe. And here is the heavenly realm, which is represented here as just a disk, because that's how it's mathematically understood, that this is a two-dimensional realm. But don't worry about that. The idea is that this is a realm outside of the physical universe that then sends and creates all of the information that creates that physical universe. And then we also had this diagram just to remind you, because we'll refer to it later, of how that energy then comes down from the essence of God into manifestation through these various stages and processes. And it is this vertical descent of divinity, and then this vertical ascent from us here back up into God. And that is this practice that I'm referring to. It's not just me, as vertical respiration. So how is this depicted in terms of conceptually? How do we understand this conceptually? And there's lots of ways that we see this represented in images. So here's an example. The human being somehow connected to the larger rays and presence in the universe. There are so many examples on the internet. I just have a few here just to kind of help us open up. Of course, all of these are just two-dimensional examples trying to depict something that is otherworldly and beyond even the three-dimensional world. So here we have essentially the universe sort of cast within this larger cosmic hologram that is creating it and informing it and even birthing it. And actually quite literally birthing it, because the understanding is that the source is really those hyperspaces, these higher planes of reality up here. this is the real reality, and all of these are the offspring of it, if you will. And just some other examples. Here's a close-up of that one. Here's a kind of example depicting that the core and the access to these heavenly realms, to this hyperspace, to these otherworldly realms, is within the depths of our own hearts. There's another way of looking at it, the human being, looking at the cosmic eye, looking back at the human being. And here's an example of someone trying to depict four-dimensional hyperspheres, and you can't do it from a three-dimensional space, so it looks funny. I won't go into that, but that's a kind of a mathematical depiction of a four-dimensional set of hyperspheres viewed from a two-dimensional object. So these things go on in different ways, and scientists are beginning to try to understand this, trying to basically move into these higher realms. This is one example of what's called convolutional neural networks and how they see. This is not something I know much about. I just found it on the internet, but I wanted to bring it out to show you that science is beginning to work with how do we understand these higher dimensions of consciousness? How do they process in the brain and in the mind and in our being? And then we have these various images of what's sometimes called Indra's net. I think we've spoken about Indra's net recently here. That's the idea that the whole universe is contained in each droplet of the universe, right? That the universe is sometimes depicted as this vast array of jewels, each one of which reflects all of the others. And so this is an image of Indra's net, where each of these little spheres here is a reflection. Each one of these reflects all the others in its facets. And here's another image, water droplets. So if you look closely, each droplet reflects all the others around it. This is another image, sort of the cosmic Christ sitting in the midst of all the body of Christ all around. So these images are all over and all inadequate to the reality. But if we look at this image for a moment and just imagine that this is the entire universe, and every point of light here, every tiny little point, is one particular being like you or me. And there it is, the entire three-dimensional universe evolving in time, floating in space. And so imagine that that's the whole thing, 30 billion light years across. And then the walls of this building, the ceiling, the floor, all of these are the hyperspace that contains that universe. So this is the physical manifest universe. And all of these spaces all around are holding it and embracing it. And they are actually the source of it. And so it sits here, and if we try to explore this universe with our telescopes, with our thoughts, with our physical experimental apparatus, we stay entirely confined inside this. In fact, if you decide I'm going to drive my spaceship out of the universe, and you get in a rocket that goes at the speed of light, and you start heading straight, and I'm just going to keep going, and I'm going to get to the edge, and I'm going to, basically you're sitting here, and you're going to pierce your way and keep cruising, and you're going to bust out of here and go find those hyperspaces out there. Doesn't work. Einstein proved it doesn't work. Even if you go on a straight line forever, space itself curves. So as you cruise around, you're going straight, but the best you can do is skirt the perimeter of this baby. And you never leave it. You never leave it because the space-time continuum is confined, and that's something that's now been demonstrated in physics. And the curvature of space due to gravity has been proven and observed with the sun's rays, for example, deflected around, with rays from outer stars deflected around the sun as they come in. So anyway, there's a lot of ways in which that has been established. So you cannot actually get out of this bubble using any of the physical means available to us. But there is a pathway. There's a pathway that the mystics have discovered that can take you out of this whole we might call it base station mansion, if you will, of the entire cosmos, which is not small. It has 100 billion galaxies, and each one has 100 billion stars. So we're not saying, that it's physically small, but it is limited. And we have access to that infinite realm beyond. We have access to those many mansions. And lastly, I know that I overdo the fractals, but I've just got to show you, because in one sense, I want to just remind you that all of these images are all created by computer graphics, trying to imagine this. But this is very practical. You can just, this is made by Earth, not by some computer scientist. And this is just a little vegetable that you can buy in the store. And it contains this wisdom. And if you explore it deeply, as you know, so if you look right down on the top of it, here's the center point out of which spirals this whole manifest evolution. And it has this remarkable structure that each part of it is a replica of the whole again. And in particular, if you say, well, yeah, but the part doesn't contain the whole. Like this nodule is here. It's not the same as this one. And there's one in between it. But if you look at this one, it has a representation of that nodule right here, and it has one in between it and here. So this represents this represents that one. So this one is actually a miniature physical representative of that one, completely replicated. And then if you go and magnify this 100 times, you find the same thing replicated there. So I'm just pointing out that this is not some made-up idea by some weird quantum physicist, or some Will Keepin who's, spouting off God knows what. These kind of broccoli have been edible and findable. These kind of fractals are out in the universe. They're teaching us, as St. Paul said, the book of nature is another book of Revelation, right? So these teachings are there. And now I want to get to an example of how this all works. At this conference, I had the privilege of meeting another famous scientist who is named is Professor Luc Montagnier. I was practicing with Pierre there to try to get my French pronunciation right, especially in Canada, at least. So Professor Luc Montagnier, he shared the Nobel Prize in 2008 in medicine for discovering the HIV virus. And so he was the co-chair of this conference. That's his picture there. And I got to meet him and hang with him. And at one lunchtime, we sat down. And, of course, there was a lot of talk about his discovery of AIDS and his whole process of AIDS and how it's all evolved and what's happened. And so I shared a story with him that I thought he wouldn't know about. I knew he'd know about one part, but he wouldn't know the fullness of this story. And this story is about how the other mansions become available to someone through the doorway of the heart. So there's a little backstory to this story. And that is, we'll begin here with, this is the former president of South Africa a couple presidents ago, Thabo Mbeki, who in many ways was quite a competent and gifted president. But he did make some significant blunders, and one of them was that he was convinced that there was no connection between HIV and AIDS. Some of you may remember this. And so he blocked antiretroviral drugs from coming into South Africa. He would not allow them to come in. This was creating a huge crisis in the international AIDS community for several years, for like almost 10 years. And of course, it became the focus of many different kind of political debates and cartoons. This is from one of the famous cartoonists in South Africa named Sapiro, showing Mbeki here denying the AIDS crisis to the media with, of course, the pile of skulls behind. And the tragedy of the crisis in South Africa was when it reached its height, there were over 900 people dying a day in South Africa. As Desmond Tutu said, that's equivalent to 2 fully loaded 747s having a mid-air collision every day over South Africa. But Mbeki stuck by his guns. He convened a panel of mock scientists. So this is another cartoon showing his scientific panel, including Dr. Doolittle, Dr. Seuss, and others, coming up with this idea that there's no connection between HIV and AIDS. And moreover, they had this notion that eating garlic and beetroot would basically cure AIDS. And this was promoted by him and his health minister. So, and these ideas, he really stuck to this. This is the World AIDS Conference. This is one of the earlier World AIDS Conferences. Again, it's a cartoon showing all of these different, global mobilization, HIV prevention, antiretrovirals, and then Mbeki with his voodoo science, basically putting forward this idea. And it came to a head right here in beloved Canada in Toronto in 2006 when Mbeki's health minister, Monto, whose last name I can't pronounce, it's one of those complex South African names. Her first name is Monto, and she came and presented at the Toronto World AIDS Conference, which at that time was the largest conference that had ever been held on AIDS. 24,000 people gathered. And she publicly maintained and upheld this policy of denying the connection between HIV and AIDS, that AIDS could be cured by dietary means, by especially garlic and beetroot and lemon juice. It created a huge crisis, and at that conference, 130 South African women with AIDS were seeking asylum in Canada. It was really quite dramatic. And Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, both of them, were doing everything they could to get Mbeki to reverse this policy, to change his mind. So this shows Mandela dragging Mbeki and his health minister, trying to take them up the hill to realize that this policy was deeply flawed. So that's the backstory. The other part of the backstory is this woman, Nozizwe Madlala Routledge. So she was the Deputy Minister of Health. And she researched it, and she knew that this crisis, this AIDS crisis, is not accurately diagnosed by the president, that in fact the antiretroviral drugs do work, the ARV drugs. And so, but she was muzzled. She was muzzled by President Mbeki. He silenced her. So she was basically, for 2 years, well, actually for several years, but for 2 years as deputy minister, she was just in this incredible struggle and pain. And I'm going to skip that slide for a moment and go to this. So the story that I told, because I knew that he would know all of that background. He did. He was very familiar with all of that background. But there was a backstory that he didn't know. And so this was the story that I told Professor Montagnier, which was that Nozizwe, the one who had reversed South African AIDS policy, she did that 3 weeks after attending one of our gender equity and reconciliation programs, which she convened in Cape Town. So this is her convening. That's her right there, and this is us all here. There's Cynthia with, this is Nozizwe, and then these are a couple of the other facilitators. This is Karambu Ringera, who will be visiting here in the not too distant future. So anyway, that was a female facilitator team. And so Nozizwe was there, and she basically, at one point, it was a 5-day intensive, and at one point we did the holotropic breathwork process. And she's a very practical woman. She's an amazing woman. She had been imprisoned by the South African government. She was an anti-apartheid activist, and they arrested her and they put her in solitary confinement for over a year. And she said during that year in solitary that the ants on the wall became her best friends, and she had names for them. And when they released her, she continued to do her work. She also was, prior to being Deputy Minister of Health, she was made Deputy Minister of Defense. And when they called her and said, "You are the new Deputy Minister of Defense," she said, "That can't possibly be the case." She said, "There must be some mistake. I'm a Quaker." And then the president called her and said, "Yes, I want you to be Deputy Minister of Defense." So she went to her Quaker community and did what they call the Quaker Clearness Committee, if you know what that is. It's a very beautiful process. We might do it sometime in our course. But in any case, she needed the support of her Quaker community, and she decided together with them that she could take this position as Deputy Minister of Defense if she took on the mission of converting South Africa's military mission to be one of a peacekeeping force. And she did that. She did that in her tenure. And after that, she was promoted to Deputy Minister of Health. Now, Mbeki was very clever because South African Constitution they wanted equal rights for men and women, very progressive Constitution in 1984. So he wanted to give this appearance of gender inclusivity. And what he did was he appointed a number of women ministers, but they were all basically, if we could call them this, yes women. Like his Minister of Health, she basically supported him on whatever he said. But with Nozizwe, he got something different because she spoke truth to power, and so he silenced her. So she was sitting with that struggle for those years. Then she came to this gender workshop, and she did this holotropic breathwork, and when she went into it, she said to us, Cynthia and me, she said, "I'm sure nothing will happen for me. She didn't say it outright, but what she meant was this is like really out there, woo-woo, California mysticism, lying down and breathing. It won't work for me. But since I have convened this whole thing, I'll try it out." And she lay down, and we went into the process, and 2.5 hours later, when she came out, we always check in very closely. We asked her, "How are you doing? What's happening?" And she said one line. She said, "I had a very powerful experience with the mother of one of my colleagues." Okay, great. And that was it. 3 weeks later, this headline. She pulled a press conference together. She reversed single-handedly the entire AIDS policy of South Africa on World AIDS Day 2006. She committed billions of rand to bring ARVs into South Africa and launched what is till this day considered one of the most effective and successful ARV treatment campaigns in the world. And she did that 3 weeks after this workshop. Of course, Mbeki was not pleased, and within a few months he found a pretext and fired her. And here the cartoonist is showing her crucified on the AIDS ribbon cross, if you will. So, back to Nozizwe. That's all she told us. We didn't know anything else. The next year, Mbeki fired her. The next year, he lost the election. And she was one of the reasons. There were other reasons. But definitely the public's loss of faith in him because they loved Nozizwe. She was considered a national and international hero. And certainly in the international AIDS community, she reversed this long-standing policy, which the Harvard School of Public Health estimated was responsible for 330,000 unnecessary deaths. That was an official estimate from the Harvard Public School of Health. So, 3 years after this, in 2009, Nozizwe was invited to a conference on patriarchy in South Africa. She was a keynote. by this point, they had a new president, and she was now no longer the president. I mean, she was no longer deputy minister. And she gave a talk about patriarchy in South Africa. And she spoke about this experience, this gender reconciliation work, and then she spoke about the breath work that she had. And she basically told what happened in this visionary experience. And what happened was that she had a visitation from the mother of President Mbeki, who came to her in a vision and basically said, now, I love my son. He's the prez, right? I love my son. I'm very proud of him. But you and I need to have a woman-to-woman talk. Because you and I both know that my son is dead wrong on this issue. And so she basically had this, essentially, she entered a mansion where the two of them who had never met were able to just speak and share. And Mbeki's mother told her, don't you be taken in. And don't you be taken in by his stubbornness and his antics, but you take him on, challenge him. And 3 weeks later, that's exactly what she did. And she reversed the South African AIDS policy. And this was a story that this Nobel laureate didn't know about. He knew about her, but he didn't know this backstory. So it was a moment of sharing this kind of dimension of that aspect of the AIDS journey. And the way that I understand what happened, coming back to this, is that Nozizwe and Mbeki's mother, who never met on this plane, were already united on the heavenly plane, brought together, had their conversations soul to soul, and that then impacted the plane, the manifest plane, if you will. And so this is just one example of the ways in which we have access, we all have access to these higher domains. And through this vertical respiration, we can reclaim the fullness of our humanity and the oneness of our identity with the divine and with one another. So let's just close with some, again, closing your eyes for a moment. And just returning to your breath. And as you breathe in, feeling that yearning in the heart, that aspiration in the heart for realizing God, for uniting with God. And just becoming aware of the in-breath, inviting and invoking the divine into the depths of your being. Thy will be done in me. And on the out-breath, offering yourself. My will be one in thee. Offering your will, offering your life. Giving yourself. Giving yourself to the one who has given you life. And knowing in the depths of your being that this simple practice of invoking the Supreme and giving yourself to the Supreme will lead you into your highest destiny, will enable you to visit those many mansions of the house of God. And will lead you to fulfill your highest purpose. Amen.
We are many, but together we're one. We will give our love to those with none. We will work to help the less fortunate ones. The heart knows how to give. If you had the chance to help a lonely child all alone in the night with dreams so wild, would you share your kindness to bring a smile? The heart knows how to give. In the table of plenty, there is always room for one more friend in need. Was there a time in your life when you needed help and someone gave it gracefully? So take a moment when you say goodnight to a loved one and turn off the light. I made a difference, I did what's right. The heart knows how to give. At the table of plenty, there is always room for one more friend in need. Was there a time in your life when you needed help, when someone gave it gracefully? When you say goodnight to a loved one and you turn off the light, I made a difference, I did what's right. The heart knows how to give. The heart knows how to give. The heart knows how to give.